Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Christian Piccolini was 14 years old. He was angry. And he was afraid. His anger and his fear made him vulnerable. It opened him up to anything that would soothe his anger and calm his fears. So he was 14 years old when he attended the first gathering of what would become the Hammerskin Nation, a violent white power skinhead group. And when he looks back, he describes the introduction to this group as receiving a lifeline of acceptance. He describes the moment like this: I felt a sort of energy flow through me that I had never felt before, as if I was part of something greater than myself, he says. And from that day forward, he was totally transformed. As a young kid, he did what a lot of young kids did. He formed a band. And his band was dedicated to the message and the propaganda that he heard, that wanted to raise up his own identity as a white person, as an Italian person in Chicago. Now, I want to stop here for just a second, because I don't think there's anything wrong with being either one of those things. I myself identify as probably a white, cis-normative, former Lutheran American. When I see a Jell-O salad in a mold filled with peas and shredded carrots, I think, my people. All of us have identities. Identities help us to know who we are. All of us have the ways that we see ourselves. All of us want to feel like we belong somewhere. For years, when I worked as a choral singer, I felt an intense sense of belonging because I was part of this choir and that choir. We identify along the lines of our race, certainly our ethnic background. We identify along the lines of our sexuality, of our gender, our professions. And all of these can be marvelous ways to know who we are. But the trouble starts when we use our identity as a weapon, when we use it as cheap wallpaper to cover over the cracks of our fear and anxiety. That these identities are ways to paper over the sense that we are not enough, that we are never enough, and that what is happening in the world is going to leave us behind, and that we will not have a place, that we no longer will have belonging. For someone like Christian Piccolini, this went to the far extreme. His membership in this band became a weapon, a tool for other young people who similarly felt angry, who felt lonely, who needed a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of identity, because there was a rhetoric and there was a culture ready to embrace them, ready to give them what they desperately, desperately needed. And that anger was a catalyst for violence. It makes me think of our friend, our saint day today, St. Paul. Now, we have this sort of like superhero comic book version of his story in Luke and Acts. That came about 50 or 60 years after Paul writes his own letter to the people of Galatia, which we would now think of sort of southern Turkey. We have the blinding flash, the audible theophany, right? Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? You can't blame Luke. The guy's got a flourish for writing. He's got a real literary style. But in Paul's own words to the people of Galatia, he tells a somewhat different story. There's no vision of him being knocked off of his high horse as we see in later Renaissance paintings. Just some kind of a catalyst, some kind of a transformation, some kind of way that God reaches into his life in the midst of his own violent identity. There was nothing wrong with being Jewish. There is nothing wrong with participating in that culture. There was everything wrong as using that as a reason for violence. There was everything wrong with finding in that an excuse, finding in that a reason to harm another group because your own feeling that maybe my group is threatened, maybe the world is changing, maybe things were not as they always were. Now, the question of this kind of identity can feel super remote to us. We don't identify in these ways. Looking out here, I don't think that any of you are members of a white power band. I'm not. That's not what this is about, though. It's about recognizing what is at the true source of who we are. And what is at the true source of where our call is. So what happens to Paul? He's on the road to Damascus, he says. This much we can agree on. He says that in Galatians. Luke and Acts say that too. He's on the road to Damascus. He's going up. He's going north. And what happens? Something is changing for him. Now, one thing I can tell you about hate, about pure, unadulterated hate, is that hate is deeply informed. Paul probably knew everything there was to know about Jesus. Everything he could find out, everything that there was to know about these people, these followers of the way, he probably had that all down. All the teachings, all the practices, what the meals were, all of it. He probably knew a lot about it. And isn't that just the way? Have you ever really hated a song? Have you ever had that song live in your head for like months at a time? I'm not saying that I hate the Captain and Tennille, but it feels even mean to like say a song lyric right now because maybe it's going to live in your head for a few months too. Don't think love will tear us apart. There is something about hate that is just so energizing, isn't it? And you just know everything about the group that you think is wrong. And what's amazing is that the groups you think are wrong are usually the ones that are butted up the closest to you. The ones that are so close that all those differences that from 55,000 feet seem to not exist are the ones that feel like they are the size of the Grand Canyon. So there's these Jesus followers, these members of this Jesus movement. They call themselves the Way. They belong to these, church is not quite the right word. Church is kind of what we're looking at right now. Church, in this sense, is the word ecclesia. Ecclesia is like one of those Greek words that means a gathering of people that come together, kind of a democratic body, come together to talk about stuff and make decisions. It wasn't even this formal. He knew all about their little gatherings. He knew all about how the message of love, how the message of things that are life-giving, how the message of resurrection was moving through the land. And that felt like a threat. Now, I'm quick to add that Paul, coming from the tradition of Pharisees had a message of love. They had a message of things that were life-giving. They had a message of God's grace. It looked very different from the message of the Jesus followers. And maybe it was the proximity of those messages that lit that flame inside of Paul and made him do violence to the people that he had power over. So what changed? What are the things that change us in our lives? What are the moments that you can identify where you felt one way and realized you were feeling another? I know what mine was. I've told many of you this story many times. For years I had rejected the church that I'd grown up in, rejected its messages, felt too constricted, felt certainly constricted as a woman, recovering Lutheran. And over time, bit by bit, God brought me back. The moment when I knew that I was back was singing in Christ Church in New Haven, watching my mentor, Greta Getline, in a chasuble like this one, elevating the host toward the altar while we sang William Byrd's Agnus Dei from the Mass of Four Voices. Piece I'd sung many, many times in a Roman Catholic context. And in that moment I knew it all came as a flash. But it wasn't a flash out of nowhere. It was the culmination of all the ways that God had been chipping away at my life. And what I had thought previously to be my association with church to be insignificant. When I worked as a music director for the Presbyterians, I called it my God job. All of that changed. And I knew that this was when I took this seriously. And my life was going to have to go in a different direction. That happens for a lot of us. That moment when we know that our life has to go in a different direction. And maybe, just maybe, we've not only been wrong and misguided, but dead wrong. It's not to say that our complaints weren't valid, but maybe the source of the pain is not what we thought. Maybe that's happened for you at some point. Maybe it happened when a job changed or was lost, when a relationship was severed. Maybe it happened when your first child or your first grandchild was in your arms and you could smell their baby hair. Maybe it happened the first time you experienced mastery in a craft, in a job, in some aspect of your life. First time I ever baked a loaf of bread that looked like the loaves I make now. It's transformative. And that's kind of small potatoes compared to other things. What are the ways in which we are transformed? Or maybe you are waiting today, maybe right now where you are waiting for that moment of transformation. Maybe you've heard about this for other people, and you think, no, I'm too old, or I'm too jaded, or I'm too young. Maybe this will happen later. Maybe this only happens to other people. Maybe that transformation is not for me. It's hard to imagine how someone could go from being the leader of a white supremacist band to someone who starts an organization to help bring people into reconciliation, out of that way, that death-dealing way of life, and into a life of abundance. How do these things happen? For Christian Piccolino, it happened in two ways, both the big way and the little chipping away way. And in my opinion, that's how most of these things happen. Big and lots of little. The big way was looking into the eyes of someone that he was harming and being surprised by the empathy he experienced when he saw the light of fear in someone else's eyes. But of course, it's easy to dismiss such moments, right? It's easy to think that was a little crazy, or the regular culture sort of surrounds you and says that's not really what happened. It's easy to gaslight ourselves out of the big moments in our lives. It's easy to say that didn't matter to me. Standing in front of that work of art and feeling my eyes well up was not important when maybe it was. Watching something on the news that changes your heart, but later you can say that wasn't that important, but maybe it actually was. So God's got to get our attention in another way. for Piccolino, it happened in a shocking way. He was trying to advance his own agenda. He opened a record store in Chicago that they sold music just like the kind of stuff that he made and played. But it turns out that wasn't enough to support. That very slender genre of music was not enough to keep the record store open. So he had to augment it with other kinds of punk music. And then, some heavy metal music, and then eventually maybe some rap music. And then the clientele begins to be more than one kind of person. And he sees that there are Jewish people and black people and Latino people coming in. And at first he can't even abide that they're coming into his store, but then he starts to talk to them, and he talks to them over time. And chip by chip, drip by drip, he realizes that he has been not only wrong, but dead wrong. Conversion is not just falling off the horse in a blinding light. It's what happens over time. But it does require that all of us step off our own high horse from time to time. And for Paul, it's the same. Bit by bit, drip by drip. Maybe the ways in which he had absorbed the teachings of this radical, this Jesus, maybe they begin to chip away at his own soul, drip by drip, chip by chip. Maybe he began talking to some of the people that he was chasing after. Why are you so happy anyway? What is putting that light in your eyes? How dare you experience that light? And then maybe it's, how do you experience that light? We are invited. We are invited exactly where we are to reflect, to notice where God is exhibited in our lives, where God shows up. And most of the time, it's not going to look like the big voice. It's not going to look like the flashing light. Although sometimes it does. We are invited to be transformed, to allow these things to change us. That the moments that we have like this, the bits and the time, can be the things that change us forever. Where do you need change? Where do you require transformation? Where is the vulnerable spot in your own life? There are 100,000 ways that the enemy wants to give you something death-dealing. Something that says everybody else is wrong, you're right. These other people over here, they're to blame for your trouble. They're to blame for your worry. What if instead, in those places where we are open, in those places where we are afraid, in those places where we're not sure where to go on, we opened ourselves up to God's light, that we began to identify with the light of Christ, that we begin to identify with the resurrecting power. Resurrection is such a great word. It not only means a coming back to life after being dead, it also means standing up, literally standing up. What if we experience the standing up with Christ? What if we experience that sense that maybe before, where we were not fully alive, as we stand up with Jesus and identify first and foremost as followers of this Christ, we experience that new life, that new richness, that new sense of purpose. My friends, today we are meeting in our annual meeting. It's this time when we get to celebrate everything we've done in the past year. That's why I look forward to it. There's so much for us to celebrate. And we also look forward to where we're going in the future. We have the opportunity this day, this moment, in this very hour to claim the life-giving light and love of Jesus. And to say that as members of St. Paul's, another identity that we claim. Our role, our choice, is to stand up with Jesus, is to stand up for what we believe in, to stand up for loving God, loving ourselves, and loving our neighbors with all our heart, all our minds, and all our strength. Is to stand up to say that every single human being has the inborn, indwelling light of God inside of them, and we are here to stand up for that. If you've been looking for the invitation, this is it. If you've been waiting for God to come into your life, God is here. I see God here in the lights of every single person in this room. I see God here in our sacrament. I see God here in the shared work that we have done. And I see God here in the potential for all we will do together. Our identity is as beloved children of God. When we claim that singular and most important identity for ourselves, we're not just giving ourselves a gift, although that sense of belonging is a treasure. We are saying no to the death-dealing culture and saying yes to life in abundance. May it be true for you